I'm really delighted to introduce my friend and former colleague, Steve Coll, about whom I'd like to say a couple of things before he does. Steve and I worked together at the Washington Post, where as managing editor during the beginning of the last decade to its midpoint, he presided over what was, for those of you who like surfing films, the sort of endless summer period of being at a newspaper before this sort of permanent gloomy winter descended on the industry. Steve grew up in suburban Washington, D.C., and like another bright and ambitious young man of our generation, he fled an exotic island environment for Occidental College in Los Angeles. And then over 20 years at the Post, he was a feature writer, an investigative reporter, and foreign correspondent covering South Asia, and an editor in Washington. He has won 2 Pulitzer Prizes, first for a series about the Security and Exchange Commission, and in 2005 for Ghost Wars, his landmark book about the CIA, bin Laden, and Afghanistan, leading up to September 11th, 2001. Since leaving the Post in 2005, he has been a staff writer for the New Yorker magazine, and since 2007, the president and CEO of the New America Foundation in Washington, a position he'll leave at the end of this year after transforming New America into a leading source of discussion, scholarship, and publishing in Washington. Over this period, he has also written 2 more towering books, The Bin Ladens and Private Empire, ExxonMobil and American Power, published earlier this year. In all the years I've known him, or at least in my experience, the only thing that he doesn't know how to do is waste time. Steve has a unique talent for the narration of closed histories, for deconstructing complex systems and digging up truth that in the case of ExxonMobil was literally underground. He is a public intellectual in the richest and most vital sense, as those of you who follow his work know. He's inspired other journalists with the breadth of his curiosity and enthusiasms. I once endured a 5-hour cab ride through the Serbian countryside that was being bombed by NATO forces, listening to Steve conduct a seamless exegesis or a ranking of all of the basketball players from the former Yugoslavia who had ever played outside with the cab driver. But most of all, he's inspired people with his infectious sense of journalism's higher purpose. The ideas that with the right tools, you can, if not move the world, then at least see it more clearly. So welcome, Steve.
Thank you. Thank you. So thank you, Phil. Thank you, Dean. Thanks to all of you for being here, and to the school for giving me this opportunity. I was just in Budapest last month. I was thinking a lot about that drive. I hadn't been back there since we went around getting our visas some time ago. I'm going to try to do a few different things, and I hope I'll pull them together. I want to talk a little bit in the broad sense about corporate responsibility, which is one of the subjects that I investigated in this book, by which I mean basically the question, what is it that we expect of our corporations and why? And what is the geography of their power in our democracy? And how do they define and manage their own interests as political actors, as corporate citizens, as people, as the Supreme Court has found them to be, at least in First Amendment terms. And I want to get at that through the specific case that I spent 4 years working on in this book, ExxonMobil, and talk a little bit about the character of that corporation, the largest in the United States, with roughly $450 billion in annual revenue. That's about the size of the economic activity of Norway. If it were a country, it would be about 30th in the world. And it is a place, a very remarkable corporation, very distinctive, and it is conscious of its own sovereignty in the world, and I want to talk a little bit about that. But I want to also just talk about what it's like to take on a project like this as a journalist and give you a little bit those of you who are interested in journalism and media, a taste of the narrative of an investigator dealing with the peculiar subject of a corporation as a subject. You know, I spent most of my career working on government agencies or governmental power in one sort or another, and I found, was reminded that working on the subject of corporate sovereignty and corporate influence in our society is something that journalists don't do as much as they might, or certainly that they used to, and maybe there's some reasons why that I can mention. So let me start with a story. March 23, 1989, in Valdez, Alaska. On that night, a man who some of you will recognize his name, Joseph Hazelwood, the captain of the Exxon Valdez oil tanker, and he was drinking vodka in the Pipeline Club in Valdez, Alaska, a small town on the edge of the Prince William Sound. I don't know, have any of you been to the Prince William Sound? I went there to research the book, and I was just astonished that the United States possesses an inland sea of such extraordinary beauty and marine diversity, whales, sea lions, otters, bald eagles, salmon, halibut, just a breathtaking place. And, but on that night, Joseph Hazelwood was in the throes of what he would later describe as a midlife crisis. He was quite a bright man. He had graduated from the country's elite maritime university. He had an IQ back in the days when people paid attention to such things of 138. He would quote Oscar Wilde and Stonewall Jackson on the bridge of his ship. But he had gone into a sort of descent, as he described it. He was drinking typically each day 4 or 5 doubles before dinner, and then wine, and then 4 or 5 doubles after dinner. And he was in the process of doing this at the Pipeline Club when he boarded the Exxon Valdez and headed off into Prince William Sound. And he noted afterwards that he had developed a kind of an accommodation with alcohol in which he never really felt disabled by it. And indeed, he functioned professionally, making $100,000 a year in 1989 dollars in this condition. And off he went into the Sound, heading toward the Pacific to deliver a cargo of 1,200,000 barrels of oil to international markets. Now, the passage out through the Prince William Sound is sort of organized like a road. You basically drive on the right. There's a 10-mile outbound shipping lane and a 10-mile inbound shipping lane. And they got around the arm of the Sound and into the main sea. And ahead, in the night water, you could see an iceberg bobbing in the middle of the outbound shipping lane. Not unusual for March. The Columbia Glacier drops a lot of ice into the Sound. And there was a standard procedure which he followed. He radioed back to the Coast Guard and said, I spot this iceberg. If there's no inbound traffic, what I'd like to do is cut across to the inbound lane, straighten out, go past the iceberg, straighten back out, carry on to the Pacific. Coast Guard said, there's no inbound traffic, go ahead. So he said to his crew, to his first mate, do you guys think you can handle this? Because they had done this maneuver many times before. This was a standard route for the Exxon Valdez. And his first mate said, yeah, boss, I think we can do this. He said, I got some paperwork I want to do downstairs, and he left the bridge. Now, those of you who remember what followed will think of the Exxon Valdez wreck as a kind of drunk driving accident. Here was a man with a clear alcohol problem. He'd been arrested for a DUI in the United States on shore a couple of times. ExxonMobil had not taken action against him despite these arrests. But at the moment when the wreck truly began, he left the bridge. He was actually not on the bridge for the rest of the episode. What actually happened in the next 15 or 20 minutes is still not really clear. If you read all the testimony that's been gathered, what you can say is that the group that he left behind, which he shouldn't have left behind, the captain should not have left the bridge under ExxonMobil rules at that time, they just became disoriented the way pilots sometimes do in a fog. They lost their bearings. The next thing that happened was the sound of the hull of the ship crashing onto Bligh Reef, a well-charted obstacle on the far side of the inbound shipping lane. So they just kind of crossed right over and failed to straighten out and ripped open the hull of the ship. And as that terrible sound echoed through, the first mate ran down to the captain's cabin, banged on the door, and said, vessel aground, we are effed, he said, like that. And Hazelwood popped out of his cabin, ran upstairs, found a toilet, vomited. And he said later that the world he knew, he understood at that moment, had just come to an end. Now, that moment, the world that ExxonMobil had known had just come to an end. And another chapter of national engagement with the question of what responsibilities corporations have as independent actors to the communities, to the environment, to their government, in courts, also began. And one of the reasons that I chose to sort of start the book that I ultimately wrote about ExxonMobil with that episode was because it turned out to be not just central in the life of ExxonMobil, but emblematic of how maddening and complex and elusive this set of questions that we have about what we expect of corporations, what their obligations are, legal, ethical, social, political, might be. At the moment of that, two quick points about that. At the moment of the wreck, a guy named Lord John Brown, who was the chief executive of BP, British Petroleum as it was then known, happened to be in Alaska. He was visiting BP's properties on the North Slope. Somebody woke him up and said, we hear there's been a wreck of an Exxon ship and oil is spilling all over the Sound. He ordered a helicopter, flew up over the Sound, and in the spring of 2010, he published a memoir in Britain. Obviously, oddly, it wasn't published in the United States, but he published a memoir in Britain in which he recalled that moment when he flew over the Sound and saw the oil spilling onto the ground. And he writes that he thought about all the whales that would be damaged and all of the other wildlife, the fisheries that would be disrupted. And I just want to quote him accurately. And then he said, and I looked down and I thought, the industry was now measured by its weakest member, the one with the worst reputation. That oil company was now Exxon. He wrote that in March 2010 about an event in 1989. And in April of 2010, what goes around came around. I think one of the problems that I found in writing about ExxonMobil's relationship with its own responsibilities, its own image, its own position in relation to customers and to society was that it was always very difficult to define the difference between corporate responsibility and branding, because they are conflated. That is, the legal and ethical obligations of a corporation also interact with the question of how they manage their relationship with their customers. It's in the interest of corporations to have customers who respect and appreciate them, especially retail corporations. The oil industry is a little bit more distant from its customers. But Nike can't afford to have you think that it is fundamentally an unethical corporation. Apple cannot afford to have you think that purchasing their products is an unethical act. So their sense of corporate responsibility is embedded in their business model. What's interesting about ExxonMobil is because they don't have retail customers in a similar configuration, they can afford a little bit more sort of independence. But what the Exxon Valdez told them was that they're out there betting their company's reputation every day in a very complex industrial system in which they can't control everything, although certainly they can control whether or not they allow captains with DUIs onto the bridge of their ships. So last comment about the Valdez, and I'll turn to the kind of larger journey I went on. As I say, we think of that accident now, even all these years later, as a kind of drunk driving accident, and there were some pretty good late night comedian jokes. David Letterman's top 10 list, why did he crash? He was just trying to get near the iceberg to get some ice for his margarita, and things like that. But as I mentioned, he wasn't even on the bridge when the accident took place. If if today's technology and Coast Guard management systems had been in place, the Coast Guard would have seen that the ship was off course much earlier than necessary to correct it. They would have alerted them, prevented the accident. The Coast Guard didn't have the radar to spot that because its budgets had been so drastically cut in the 9 years before 1989 that it didn't have the technology to observe vessels with 1 million+ barrels of oil trafficking in the inland sea that far out. And if they had that technology and ExxonMobil had called back to stay in touch with them, it turned out that night that 2 of the Coast Guard officers on duty were away from their desks and later were reported to be smoking marijuana during the accident. So, this was a systemic failure. ExxonMobil, in the previous 10 years before the Valdez wreck, had reduced its workforce from 180,000 to 100,000 in basically 7 years. Now, any of you who have worked in an organization know you cannot reduce your workforce by roughly 40% in 7 years without disrupting management controls, operational integrity, the integrity of the organization. They had eliminated their own environmental compliance department as part of this cost cutting. So what this, I think, ultimately what I judged all these years later looking at it was that this was really a failure of risk management, failure of corporate risk management, governmental risk management, a failure of the compact between regulator and regulated. It was a systemic failure that signaled patterns that were likely to repeat, and in fact did repeat. But that's not actually how the event was mainly received. So ExxonMobil seemed to me a pretty good way to conduct a case study of a lot of these questions, as I mentioned. And it's a very distinctive institution. You could even say it's a peculiar institution. I mentioned its scale. That's the first thing about it. $450 billion. $450 billion in revenue. And it is, on paper, when I started to look at the Securities and Exchange Commission records about where they hold oil and gas around the world and how they organize themselves and how they interact with governments and the diversity of political interests that they possess, I thought to myself, as a potential theme of the book, oh, this looks like a sovereign to me. This almost looks like this looks like a corporate sovereign, a multinational corporate sovereign. It looks a little bit like a state, except it's spread out on the map in a little bit, not in a contiguous way. And one of the things that surprised me when I started interviewing and reporting was to find right away that that's how they see themselves. They're very self-conscious of their own sovereignty. It's built into the way they think about strategy, about their place in the world, and they don't see themselves as a U.S. sovereign. They see themselves as a global sovereign. There's a scene in the book where one of the 2 chief executives whose span is chronicled, Lee Raymond, who's a very larger-than-life character, is in a meeting in Washington, D.C., and they're talking about building extra gasoline refining capacity in the United States, mainly for the purpose of having resilience in case there's a disruption to global supply. An extra refinery would just give us a little bit of extra flexibility. And Raymond says, but I'm not going to build a refinery for that reason. I'm not a U.S. company. And some of the other people in the meeting were shocked, but that was just a characteristically direct way of Raymond saying what is in fact the case. They're headquartered in Texas, but of their 80,000 employees, most of them are non-Americans. They operate in more than 100 different countries under many different schemes of national law and international law. There's another moment where Raymond is buying a Russian oil company called Yukos that was owned by Mikhail Khodorkovsky, who's now perhaps Russia's most famous jailed dissident. And Khodorkovsky was trying to sell a piece of the company, and Raymond didn't want to buy it until he met with Vladimir Putin directly to ask him about this. And so he meets with Putin at the stock exchange. They meet for an hour, hour and a half, and Raymond says, look, Mr. President, I want to do this deal, but I'll only do it if I can buy 51%. I only want a controlling interest. You can do whatever you want with the 49% that stays behind. And Putin says, well, but if I did that, would that mean that every time I wanted to do something at Yukos, anything at Yukos, that I'd have to come and talk to you and ask you permission? And Raymond said, yeah, but that's not so bad. It's like that in a lot of parts of the world. He said, I don't know. So that's what I mean by that. This kind of sense of self-awareness is already part of their premise. So they're a multinational sovereign, and they have a very long-term view of their own interests, properly so, because they deploy capital over 20 and 40-year spans. Their business model basically is to go out into the world and drill holes in the ground and sit on top of those holes for 40 years at a time and extract their full value. And these are very expensive holes to drill, and yes, you can structure the contract to get your capital back on the front end, but basically the model is about the long term. And so they have a view of the international system that is based on these 40-year time horizons. They are also very confident about their own strategy. And they're more coherent in thinking about energy policy and the energy mix than, for example, the United States government is. I came to think as I worked on this that they really are a better description of our energy policy than whatever white papers the Department of Energy happens to publish as administrations with completely different philosophies of emphasis come and go from Washington. And then the other thing that's interesting about them, I came to think, was as a model, as a case study. You look at industrialized democracies today in Europe, in the Americas. It's natural, it seems natural in this political economy and in this energy economy to produce a large state-owned oil company that's very closely tied to the sovereign government. So virtually every major industrialized democracy has one. Total in France, Eni in Italy, BP, Dutch Shell in Britain and Holland, and so on down the list. Well, ExxonMobil is our state oil company, except only in America would our state-owned oil company live in a state of opposition to the state, which is essentially ExxonMobil's position. I mean, in France, as you can imagine, Total and its executives all went to the same schools with the Minister of Finance and the Minister of Energy and the Minister of Commerce and the Prime Minister, and when they interact together, government and state oil company in West Africa or elsewhere, they do so as a partnership. The chief executive of ExxonMobil, who succeeded Lee Raymond, a guy named Rex Tillerson, who now runs the company, was recently asked by a magazine what his favorite book is, and he said Atlas Shrugged. Now that's the Ayn Rand novel that has also been popularized by Paul Ryan and others who see in it a narrative of dystopian government and dystopian dependency on government. And I'm not rendering, I'm not here to talk about Ayn Rand, but it's just unusual that a state utility function like an oil company the size of ExxonMobil would develop a culture that sees the very state to which it is connected as something bordering on dystopia. That has a kind of very American tension in it, I think. It explains some of the tension that surrounds ExxonMobil. So let me just tell you a little bit about what, as I promised, about what it's like to, what my experience of doing this project actually was. As I mentioned to a group we were having lunch with today, when I was in school, I've always wanted to do this kind of work. And when I was in school, I read a lot of big books in the 1970s that were my models for what I wanted to accomplish. The works of David Halberstam, Best and the Brightest, Reckoning, Tom Wolfe. Obviously, I don't write like Tom Wolfe and wouldn't try. Gay Talese, Neil Sheehan's Bright Shining Lie, Uncommon Ground. Common Ground about desegregation in Boston. These big, ambitious narrative works of nonfiction that emerged out of journalism and book publishing in the 70s and the 80s. And one of them that I read, and I read them all and mapped them and put them literally on my shelf and said, someday I'm going to write a book like that. And one of them was The Prize by Daniel Jurgen, some of you may have read. It's this great epic narrative of the oil age, an era of expansion and discovery in oil, also an era of expansion in American power in the post-war period, and the sort of alignment between the expansion of the global oil economy and the expansion of American power, the tensions that arose from that. And so after I had written a couple of books about America's place in the world after 9/11, I really wanted to write another volume about America's place in the world after 9/11 that was about oil. And I started out with my publisher and in my own mind's eye to write a book to update the prize in an era of limits. That was my purpose, an era of contest. And this is no longer the era of expansion. It's an era of an argument and competition on the global energy stage. And so I went out and I did about 6 months worth of work, and I thought, this is too sprawling, it's too abstract, I need a story to tell, I need a focus. And so I decided to choose a single company. And at that stage I felt for American readers I really had no choice but to choose ExxonMobil. And I really didn't know what I was getting into, I have to say. This is a very closed corporation, very effective, very disciplined, very confident about their models, including their attitudes towards journalists. And I didn't quite appreciate all of this. And I have to say the 4 years that I put in on this one is the hardest work I've ever done. And I hope the hardest work I'll ever do. The more they resisted, the harder I worked, though. And at a certain point, it became fun, but not always. But I'll just tell you what you do when you choose a subject that is located behind a wall and not interested in coming out. That's basically what I've been doing for a long time. So I have a sort of portfolio of methods, and one of my ideas is that I don't choose one method over another, I just do them all, simultaneously, continuously. Just keep applying every way to get underneath the subject that I can. So that includes interviewing, includes Freedom of Information Act requests, it includes using court records and litigation files as a way to gain insights. It includes, of course, interviewing. And it also includes knocking on the front door and announcing myself right away. That's one thing I've learned, at least my method is, when I choose a closed subject, the last 3 projects I've done, CIA, the Bin Laden family, and ExxonMobil. I'm going to start writing about baseball eventually. But anyway, ExxonMobil was definitely the hardest, but I had learned from those other 2 a little bit, to relearn some ideas about how best to proceed. And one of them is there's no gain in being coy. So I just called them right up when I made this decision and said, congratulations. I decided to write a book about you. And I don't expect you necessarily to cooperate, but I would like a chance to explain myself, give you an introduction into who I am, what I work on. The best way to understand what the book is going to feel like is to read work I've already done. I'm not a secret. I've got a lot of books out there. You can read those. Those are pretty reliable predictors of what this is going to feel like. I'd like to come down and meet you. And we started a call and response process that continued right through to the end of the process. And at the end of every process, even with people who have declined to cooperate in any way at all, I always say, as they say no, again and again, well, I hear your no, but the one thing I'll do at the end after I've drafted the manuscript is I'll hire a professional fact checker, to a New Yorker standard. That person will come back and start to talk to you about what's actually on the page about you. And you'll have one last bite at the apple then, if you'd like, to participate in this process. So I feel like I act almost as in a very professional call and response way. I don't try to manipulate sophisticated closed subjects. I just try to communicate with them. And then to do that in as persistent and calm way as possible. But in this case, at the beginning, the first thing I did was go to the Securities and Exchange Commission to make a map of the world and map ExxonMobil's oil on it. And I was quite surprised to see that a quarter of it was being produced in West Africa. I had no idea that roughly 20 to 25% of American oil production in the 2000s was coming out of West Africa, Angola, Nigeria, Equatorial Guinea, Chad, where ExxonMobil had holdings. And I looked at those particular countries where they were active, Chad, Equatorial Guinea, Nigeria in particular. I knew enough about Aceh, Indonesia was another place where they had a very large gas property. And I knew enough about those places to think, there's trouble. Those are troubled places. And I knew a little bit about their history, so the first thing I did was I went back over the 14-year period and looked at episodes in the lives of those countries where bad things had happened. Coups, guerrilla wars, violent elections, one thing or another. Episodes where clearly ExxonMobil's interests, property, and political strategies would have been implicated. And I marked out these chronologies, got a lawyer, and filed Freedom of Information Act requests with the State Department and other government agencies, very narrowly tailored around these episodes that I could see in the chronology. And my hypothesis was, there's got to be interesting stuff. ExxonMobil must have, it's got to be interesting stuff. And so you send these, you learn how to craft the FOIA, your lawyers advise you how to do it, and then it's basically, it's like throwing a message in a bottle onto the sea. You know, the response time is anywhere between 10 months and 3 years. In fact, there's still some that haven't come back. But I figured I had to get them in early. This was a 4-year project, but I needed to get them on the ocean. And then what happened was, about 11 months in, I came home one day and there in the mail was this giant yellow envelope that said Department of State on the end. And I was even puzzled, like why would, and I ripped it open and it was, 400 pages of declassified State Department cables about ExxonMobil and the Aceh guerrilla war that were just gold. I mean, I read them, I was like running around, and I was like still 2 years out. And then basically every 6 months I'd come home and there would be another yellow package. I'd be like the Wells Fargo wagon or Christmas every morning. And so slowly, every time I'd get a batch, and they came in random orders, occasionally the Freedom of Information Act officer would call you up and say, I can't really say what I'm doing, but I'm working on something to do with Chad, and maybe you'd be interested, and will you help me make a positive decision by answering the following question? So I was a little bit aware of what was going on inside the FOIA system, but generally I was just receiving these random packages. Every time I get one, I then reintegrate it into my reporting and travel plans, and go out and interview. And I was interviewing all the time, of course, too. It was, I would say that ExxonMobil was such a disciplined company that all the methods you would usually use to track down interview subjects, who are the formers, who's ever worked there, who's ever had conflict with them, has anybody ever whistleblowed, have they had EEOC suits, have they, give me a list of everyone who's retired from the company, all of that. I did all of those methods, and it was some progress. But I felt like the refusal rate was higher than I had ever known, and that it reflected an internal discipline at ExxonMobil that was itself interesting to discover. So we then tried something else, which was we went to the Federal Election Commission, the records. If you make a political donation, campaign contribution in this country, at any level that's in the federal system, doesn't matter how much you give, you have to disclose yourself. And when you disclose yourself on what you fill out, you have an option to say where you work. You don't have to, but many people do. And so we ran all the records, the computer records, and generated the names and addresses of every ExxonMobil, self-identified ExxonMobil employee who'd ever made a political contribution. And then we went onto the databases you can find, and I just basically cold called them all. On the theory that these were people who were interested enough in the way the world is to have made a political contribution to a D or an R. Maybe they wouldn't, they'd be willing to serve. And it was a very interesting kind of random survey of ExxonMobil employees and retirees at all different levels, accountants, plant managers, senior executives. And out of that survey came started to evolve like a really confident, much more confident feel for what the corporation was, what it was like to work there, some of its peculiar culture, some of which is described in the book, the very rigid safety culture they developed after ExxonMobil, in which it was basically an attempt to wring all human fallibility out of their daily operations, and this almost kind of 12-step approach to eliminating all accidents in the workplace, where you would gather in groups and confess safety errors that you had made, including away from the office. If you had been mowing your lawn and a rock came out and struck you in the leg and bruised you, you'd report that to the group. If you went on vacation and didn't use enough sunblock, you'd report that to the group. Bee stings were a reportable accident. If you left a file drawer open in the office, you would get a written reprimand because someone might bump into it. And this system actually brought their hours lost to accident and their OSHA record to, by far, the gold platinum standard in the industry, but at the price of a certain amount of serenity in the office place. Every meeting had to start with a safety minute. This practice spread around the business, but it really kind of started in this drive. And I would have started the lecture by pointing out where the exit is and asking. But if you work together in a small group and you met all the time, it was the same people 5 days a week, and you rotated responsibility for the safety minute. Some of the people we called from the FEC records said, I'd say, like, what was the hardest thing about working at ExxonMobil? And they'd say, I'd have an anxiety attack coming to the office trying to think of an original safety minute, because I'd given like 5 over the last 5. I couldn't think of anything new to say, and I'd be driving in all white-knuckled. Anyway, so I did that. And then I traveled, and the first place I went was to Africa, because I thought I could see on this map that this was going to be an important part of my narrative about what the sort of sovereignty of a corporation like ExxonMobil means. And the first place I went was Chad, and I don't know if any of you have been there. I've been in West Africa before, but I've not been to Chad, and it's really a benighted country, kind of a fourth world country at the very bottom of the Human Development Index tables. Traveled out to villages that don't have road access half the year, and where there's no access to potable water or medical services. The average life expectancy is about 47 years, and it's even by the standards of Central or South Asia or Africa, as a really degraded form of poverty in the country. And I was reporting hard, trying to figure out what ExxonMobil was up to, how they related to the authoritarian government of Idris Deby, how they behaved in certain of these coup events and so forth. But one of the large themes in the book came out of that trip, as I was talking about with lunch with some folks. After a while on the ground out there, the big question I came back to my hotel with is, what is ExxonMobil doing here? Why are they here? Here's a company with $450 billion in revenue, $40 billion a year in a good year in profits. Why do they need to be here? And the answer turned out to be very important, which is that they needed every barrel of oil they produced because resource nationalism, the rise of national oil companies that exclude Western corporations from ownership of oil and gas, had shrunk the world's map for a place like ExxonMobil. In the 1950s and 1960s, a company like ExxonMobil didn't even bother to count how much oil and gas it owned in the world because it had so much. It had access to Aramco, the state Iraqi oil company, the state Iranian oil company. But the wave of nationalist expropriations that started in the 1970s swept across the Middle East and other parts of the post-colonial world, left ExxonMobil in a position where it was shrinking. It had shrunk from 7.5 million barrels a day of production to 4.5 million barrels roughly today. And the places where they could own oil and gas were fewer and fewer for these geopolitical reasons. Essentially, from ExxonMobil's perspective, in today's world, you can own oil and gas in 2 places. You can either own it in the free market west, where property rights are sacrosanct, but where until very recently there wasn't growth in oil and gas discovery. Or you can go to very weak states, such as in West Africa, where the government doesn't have the capacity to assert the kind of nationalism that became commonplace around resources in so many other parts of the world. So ExxonMobil was in Chad because they had to be. They produce 4.5 million barrels of oil a day. That means they have to find roughly 1.5 billion barrels every year just to stay even, to stop their inventory from shrinking. And they can't afford to let any barrel of any significant scale go unpumped. And so they endure the political risk of being in places like Chad. Another place I traveled early on in that trip was to Equatorial Guinea. I don't know if any of you, I doubt any of you have been there, but I don't know if any of you even know where it is. It's a very small country, about 500,000. I didn't know where it was, to be honest. I would have failed the Jeopardy test before I went there. It's a small country, one of the few Spanish colonies in Africa. About 500,000 people live there. It's a little island and a little slice of the mainland between Gabon and Cameroon on the West African coast. It's run by a picaresque dictator whose son has recently been in the news because he bought a house in Malibu for $36 million in cash and has a collection of exotic cars and Gulfstreams and speedboats. And the per capita income of Equatorial Guinea has risen from like $300 to $20,000, but the life expectancy rate hasn't budged, and the poverty that you see in the interior looks not too much different from that you find in Chad. But I was invited nonetheless by the president, and the book reflects that I interviewed him at his palace, and I had a grand time reporting on the ground. But one of the other themes that I came across from that early travel that became important to the rest of the book was just looking around at this tiny country and all the coups that visited, one after another. You realize that in a lot of these poor and unstable places where ExxonMobil operates, the country is really a kind of bank waiting to be robbed. It's not so much a country as a vault that induces coup making, because the only way you are reasonably going to win the lottery if you're an Equatorial Guinean citizen is to take over the presidential palace. The next morning, you'll have a Swiss bank account with $30 million in it. And so it's the structure of poverty and natural resource production in such disproportion and the absence of intermediary institutions that almost induces guerrilla and coup-making violence. And that became, I thought, an observation, a pattern in a lot of the places I work. So I want to end it and take some questions, but the other place I went that I just want to mention is Aceh, which is in the northern tip of Sumatra, a place that was wiped out by the tsunami in 2005, I guess it was, and 2004, and where there had been a century or more of separatist violence culminating in a very nasty phase of war between Aceh separatist guerrillas, Achenese separatist guerrillas, and the Indonesian army, known by its initials TNI. And a lot of that conflict in the late 90s and early 2000s had occurred around this very large natural gas field and liquefied natural gas plant that ExxonMobil owned in Aceh. They'd acquired it from Mobil in the merger in 2000. And the contract under which ExxonMobil operated required them to pay the salaries of the TNI soldiers that guarded the facilities. The TNI soldiers were in turn accused by multiple human rights investigators of running detention and torture centers on the edge of the fence line of the ExxonMobil property, capturing and doing sweep operations into local villages, picking up young men they suspected of being guerrillas, bringing these detention centers, torturing them, killing them in some cases, mutilating them in others. And in a way, Exxon, when it bought Mobil, bought this war and really didn't quite understand what it was getting into. And as they started to come to terms with the human rights violations that were being carried out by their salaried contracted soldiers, they were approached by civil society activists in the United States and elsewhere to sign up for a regime called the voluntary principles. The idea was there are certain standards of corporate conduct in violent settings that we think every resource corporation, every multinational ought to sign up for. Now, this had come out of the Clinton administration. There was some support for it in Europe. Some other oil companies and mining companies decided to sign up for it right away, partly as a prophylactic against accusations that they were irresponsible in these settings. ExxonMobil characteristically said, no, we don't sign up for other people's principles. We have our own rules. We're an ethical corporation. We don't condone human rights violations. In effect, they said, sue us, and they were sued. Their case is still in DC court on behalf of Achenese who claim to have been victims of this violence. And over part of the narrative and part of the journey of the reporting was to discover, through these FOIA requests, the materials that came back that really documented their honest thinking about these issues, was that over the next 6 years, they realized that it just wasn't sustainable to run your own armies as a corporation in this world anymore. The reputational risk, the litigation risk, never mind the ethical dilemmas, just were not sustainable. And so about 5 years after everyone else in the resource business had finally signed up to the voluntary principles, ExxonMobil did so. And then they implemented them with the same rigor and vigor that they implement their safety rules. I remember talking to a Human Rights Watch researcher. He said, that he was now admiring of ExxonMobil's commitment to the voluntary principles because it was like watching human rights be implemented by a police state. But in any event, now when you go to the Niger Delta and you look at their facilities, they're in a very different posture than they were 10 years ago, a posture of passive defense in which they just have to accept that they basically, their last resort when they're under attack is to go to a safe room and unplug everything. And that's an evolution of corporate response to citizen campaigning, really, to social campaigning, that I think, despite ExxonMobil's hard line and their sort of general public imperviousness, reflects the fact that they are citizens and are responsive to pressure of that sort in a reasonable way. So I'll just end by saying, in answer to my first question, I think in this country, among industrialized democracies, we are in a very early state of figuring out what it is we want from corporations and why, as social, political, and democratic actors. In many other of our neighboring industrialized democracies, good, bad, or indifferent, this conversation between corporations, citizens, and governments is much more mature than it is in this country. And in this country, you ask these kinds of questions, it almost feels like a third rail sometimes. And it's tied to some of the poison in our politics as well. But ExxonMobil understands that they're in a permissive environment. And they have a great deal of confidence about their ability to manage that environment. And I'll just close by relating what Lee Raymond, the chief executive who I mentioned, said when someone tried to ask him to describe his political strategy in the United States. What is the real essence of your political strategy? And he said, we see governments come and go. Thank you for your attention. Happy to take your questions. Yes.
I'm wondering what you saw in terms of the discussions in Exxon around climate change and their responsibility to do anything about it.
Yeah, I'm sorry that I left that out of this because it should have belonged, but as I was outlining, I just thought I couldn't fit it. It's a big subject in the book. In short, I was able, at least in part, to try to document a journey they went on that was very similar to the voluntary principles story. They started out in a fairly radical posture. Lee Raymond had a very personal conviction, born of his own experience as a doctoral degree holder in chemical engineering, that the Earth was not warming. He said so publicly again and again in the 1990s and late 1990s. After Kyoto, there was a lot of resistance to the bargain that Kyoto imposed on the United States because it required industrialized nations to bear the costs of ameliorating climate change and didn't impose similar costs on developing countries. And so there was a broad resistance to Kyoto on economic and fairness grounds and on the costs it imposed to the American economy. And you'll recall in the Clinton administration, the second term, the Senate voted 97-0 as a preemptive signal to the Clinton White House, don't even bring this treaty to us. So it wasn't radical for ExxonMobil to oppose Kyoto in some objective sense, but it was radical to attack the science clandestinely, which is what they did between 1997 and 2005. They funded groups, front groups and proxy groups of different kinds without disclosing that activity in many cases, in order to basically raise questions about the credibility of what was emerging science at that stage, where there was, of course, science is by its nature driven by dissent and debate, and some of these campaigning groups, almost all of which were not led by scientists, exploited the natural arguments within science about this fairly young science. And then, of course, meteorology, as we all know just from watching the 11 o'clock news, is not a perfect, it's not a hard science. It's certainly not particle physics in the replicability of forecasts. They exploited that. And this continued until actually investigations of various kinds, some by journalists, but more in this case by scientific organizations, civil society groups, campaigning groups, what you would abroad kind of blithely refer to as civil society groups in the United States, investigated some of the money trail, basically, exposed this, rallied dissenters to shareholder meetings, and put enough public pressure, including elements of the Rockefeller family, the old Standard Oil family from which ExxonMobil is descended, to turn up at shareholder meetings, and they really mainstreamed the opposition to these decisions that ExxonMobil had taken, and pushed the corporation to change course. So after Raymond retired, ExxonMobil started to defund these organizations that had been using. Their lawyers cautioned them that they risked legal liability if they admitted that what they had done all those years was wrong. So they essentially took an initial public position of, we were never wrong, we were only misunderstood. And that was part of a signal that they were moving, but also that they were moving very carefully and with lawyers, you know, in the front of the car. And then in 2009, when the Obama administration, with the Democratic Congress, proposed to enact a cap-and-trade regime to finally impose a price on carbon in the United States, the sense was, with the momentum of the Obama administration coming into office and the preparations that had been done including by other corporations that favored cap and trade, that the time was to act. And so ExxonMobil announced that it supported a carbon tax in January of 2009, about $20 a ton, wanted to be revenue neutral. But it was the first time the chief executive of America's largest oil corporation had come out in recognition that the risks of climate change justified imposing a price on the economy. And so it was a pretty significant change from where they had been. Now, of course, that bill didn't happen. And today, ExxonMobil isn't very vocal about that. But they are a long-run company. You know, looking inside their corporate planning and their strategic planning and getting your mind around this kind of 30 and 40-year planning cycle that they live on, what they want is price stability. They want predictability. They accept that a price on carbon is coming. They think they can make a lot of money in a world that has a price on carbon. They just want to know what that price is, and they want it to be stable for a long period of time. So in a sense, they're not, the coal industry has an existential problem with carbon pricing potentially, but the oil industry doesn't necessarily. And that partly explained the shift. Yes?
My name is David Lett. I'm a retired diplomat and former diplomat resident here at Duke. Your talk triggered a memory from the late 1960s when, it's kind of an off-the-wall question, there was a movie made in Italy called The Mattei Affair. And I don't know if you're familiar with that, but it's about the conspiracy theory that SO and CIA were behind the death, the very mysterious death of the head of Eni, the director of Eni, the Italian National Oil Company, who wanted to control directly Italy's extraction of gas, I guess, out of Northern Africa.
Right.
Did your work on the book discover anything about?
Well, I don't have any news about whether they're guilty, but I do remember that episode. I did look at it because it was one of the few times where ExxonMobil was forced into a settlement with American prosecutors and regulators about corrupt activities abroad. They conceded in a consent decree settlement with the Securities and Exchange Commission, I believe. Fact check this, but they conceded in a consent decree that the head of their Italian operation had been engaged in inappropriate payments to Italian politicians, and it did arise from liquefied natural gas interests that they had in Libya at that time. So, ever thus. But the, Italian political murder narratives, we could do nothing but your whole life. I don't know anything more about it. Yes?
In your talk, you mentioned Exxon's shrinking geopolitical footprint as a result of increasing nationalization of individual countries' oil programs. And historically, this isn't new. And in '53, BP kind of helped facilitate the coup d'etat in Iran, resulting in kind of a tenuous situation today. And I wanted to ask, given the situation with their Exxon and similar oil companies having less access to futures or rights to oil Do you have any, I guess, foresight into whether or not we might be able to see anything like that happening today?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's complicated in some of these unstable places. There's, these corporations are, as I say, they're the kind of property that coup makers seek. And in a place like Equatorial Guinea, the narrative in the book about Equatorial Guinea is basically a narrative of how ExxonMobil and other interests were able to take the United States government from a hands-off policy towards this onerous regime to one of security collaboration rationalized around the protection of ExxonMobil's interests. So the regime basically, and a lot of this for reputational reasons for the United States, which didn't want to be in bed with this regime, they outsourced the project to the Israeli government, who came in and basically provided the training and the counter surveillance and the speedboats and the rest of it to kind of protect this. And it's a very, when I was there, I was able to see everybody, and it's just very interesting how the world really works. And it kind of came up over a sort of 10-year period. My favorite story was, but it's all kind of a mercenary-based system. The president's palace guard are Moroccans. His basically his counterintelligence department is all Israeli. His CIA liaison is American and doing kind of just general intelligence service building. And then his helicopter gunship pilots are Ukrainians. And the basic problem is that every 6 months someone washes up on the shore and tries to take over the presidential palace so they can own the oil. And often they come on speedboats from the Niger Delta, and they just literally come in groups, 4 or 5, they park on the shore, they run out, they jump up, they shoot up the president's palace. Sometimes the president's there, they just want to occupy the palace and say, fly their flag. Someone responds and shoots them in reply. And during one of these episodes, it happened just like a couple of months before I was there, and it was fresh on everyone's minds. The guys were repelled when they got off their speedboats. The trained security forces shot back at them. They got back in their speedboats and they raced away. And the president was really angry. He said, "Get my gunships. I want them shot out of the water." So they scrambled this. It was supposed to be that every one of these helicopter gunships was co-piloted by a Ukrainian mercenary and a Equato-Guinean pilot. But the Equato-Guinean pilot didn't show up when the call was made, so the Ukrainian jumped in and he flew up and he got out over the Atlantic, and he was on top of the boat. He saw them. He radioed back and said, "I've got them." And the order came, "Shoot them." He replied, "It's not in my contract." He refused. He just basically said, I'm working the rules. I am not shooting them. If you want me to monitor them until I run out of gas, I'll do that, but I'm not shooting them. And so they got away. Anyway, it's an interesting place. The one thing I would just say, big picture, about this kind of political risk portrait, ExxonMobil is this highly risk-averse corporation, especially since the Valdez. They've been animated internally by this never again kind of attitude. We are going to do everything that engineers can possibly do to manage risk to zero, or to close to zero. But their business model is inexorably driving them into risk environments. The absence of equity, oil, and gas opportunities outside of the free market world has driven them into these unstable countries. So even as they try to take all risk out of their operations, they're being driven into risk environments. That's where they are. That's Chad, that's Equatorial Guinea, that's Nigeria, that's Angola, maybe less unstable. So there's this tension between their desire to manage risk and their business model driving them towards geopolitical risk. And then the second thing, equally on environmental and operational risk, the way the oil world has changed. The biggest factor in ExxonMobil's life that wasn't so prominent 20 years ago is the rise of global state-owned oil corporations as competitors. ExxonMobil is the largest corporation headquartered in the United States with $450 billion of revenue, but if you made a list of the world's top 20 oil corporations, it wouldn't even be in the top 10, because the top 10 are all state-owned. Gazprom, the 2 Chinese companies, etc., and Rosneft. So they're competing, and many of those companies are now operating outside of their national zones. They're going around the world to Africa looking for contracts in competition with ExxonMobil. So if you're the authoritarian leader of Chad and you've got a new field to bid, the Chinese company will come in and they'll be able to deliver a kind of geopolitical package in their bid for the contract. Alliance with China, friendly visit to the capital, a UN Security Council veto that might be relevant in your border dispute with Cameroon and so forth. ExxonMobil comes in, and their comparative advantage is not that. It's our checks will come in earlier. We will get this project done on time and on budget. And most important, we can drill for oil in environments that nobody else in the world can. The deepest water, Arctic environments, the most complex engineering projects. We can get value out of your holdings that no other company can deliver. And so by the nature of their competitive position, they're being driven into frontier operating environments. When you look at ExxonMobil's deal with Rosneft in Russia, it's enormous effort to drill in the Arctic Circle, north of the Arctic Circle in the summer now that the ice is melting. That's basically a bet the company operation. Now ExxonMobil will talk about these deep water environments and frontier Arctic environments and other innovation environments, and they'll talk about them with a great deal of confidence. They bring a lot of confidence to everything they do. But the truth is that these are frontiers. It's like aviation in the 1930s. There is a lot that just hasn't been done before in these environments, and they are betting the company every day. But now, even with their risk management philosophy, they can't control the way their business is driving them towards risk. That's true, by the way, with fracking and natural gas, where they made a huge bet onshore in the United States, confident that they can win public opinion around to the natural gas story, and maybe they will, but they haven't escaped the political risk equation just by coming to the United States, because you can see the controversy that surrounds those investments. Yes?
Are they also creating subsidiaries to do some of the less ethical activities?
There's a sort of, in the deep, dark black box of the international oil industry that involves international contracts in unsavory places, there is a toolbox of legal methods to distribute the benefits of oil contracts to people who may be in a position to influence the awarding of that contract. ExxonMobil, if they engage in that, it's very complex. I've had lawyers explain to me how you do it. Basically, there are ways to stay in compliance with the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, to paper up the whole contract, to paper up every meeting, and still get it done. But you need a really sophisticated dictator on the other side of the table who understands what it is the lawyers are saying, and who then sends the brother-in-law to the wealth advisor in Switzerland and has anyway, there's a method, but it's very complicated, and there's a little bit of risk in it. ExxonMobil's never been prosecuted for Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, and it's not because they haven't been investigated. So either they're like the best at managing this little black box thing, or, as they say, they're big enough and confident enough that they just go into these negotiations and say, well, we won't do that, but we will produce 400,000 barrels of oil out of deep water that nobody else in the world can produce. So take it or leave it. And I think, for example, the Qataris ended up doing business with them because they were able to deliver a giant industrial system that made the Qataris much richer than any other international oil company partner had been able to promise, and that didn't have anything to do with bags of money. Yes?
This question isn't really in stride with the others. It's on defense policy, but maybe it also does deal with managing risk. I'm curious what you would recommend to senior leadership in Afghanistan, either civilian policymakers or the military responsible for enforcing those policies, about how to responsibly, or if I could wager to say successfully, exit this 11-year engagement. Do you think we should sort of stay the course or refine our existing strategy?
Well, so the course is to continue the reductions of US and NATO forces in Afghanistan to some as yet to be determined point, either 0 or 5,000 or 10,000, and to do that over a period of time that allows for the possibility of a successful Afghan political transition in 2014. By constitutional schedule, President Karzai is supposed to give up office in 2014. He has said repeatedly that he intends to do so. A lot of armed groups are preparing both for the possibility that he might, and that power might be allocated peacefully in something like an election. They're also preparing for the possibility that he won't, or that he won't do it on terms that they find acceptable. And so the possibility of coups or the igniting of civil conflict beyond that which already is occurring between the Afghan government and the Taliban, is a real risk. I think that the only question for American policy now is the pace of withdrawal from direct combat and toward support for what remains of the Afghan state and the prevention of a return to the civil war, humanitarian suffering, and extremism of the 1990s. The only constraint on that kind of a failure, I think, the most important constraint on that kind of a failure is Afghans' own memories of the horrors of the 1990s. There's not very many Afghans that I've known over long periods of time traveling there who want to go back to that conflict, but it's being set up for them right now. And the question is, what can international policy do to construct a glide path that reduces violence and increases political stability during this transition in 2014 so that you at least have the possibility of an intact Afghan state in the major cities that is like the one that's there now, a confederation of different ethnic and regional groups sharing power. And there are answers to that question, but they really don't have to do with defense policy, they have to do with politics. Fundamentally, I guess my answer is that the problem with the American position in Afghanistan is that since 2009 and to some extent earlier, the American engagement has been dominated by military and security strategy and has under-resourced political strategy. That is a problem that is exposed now more than ever, but it's also the case that just looking ahead and forgetting about how we got here, it is the critical factor. It is not about how many battalions partner with how many Afghan battalions. It's about whether there's an Afghan state that any Afghan battalion feels loyal to at the end of this transition or not. And I think it's a close run thing. Yes?
Thinking of what you've learned, thinking of yourself as a United States citizen, is there any one thing that most frightens you about Exxon?
Frightens. I think they have a commitment to a 40 or 50-year strategy of oil and gas primacy that looks to me pretty unshakable. It's something that I don't regard as a moral choice of theirs. It's kind of who they are, it's what they do. And they're working in an environment where that strategy is, looks like a very successful bet. And I came into this project, to be honest, I didn't know anything about climate change. I barely paid attention to Inconvenient Truth. I understood what Al Gore believed, but I didn't really know. I hadn't reached any independent judgment about it myself. And I felt like one of the sort of gifts, but also one of the obligations of this project was to just start from the beginning and go read everything with my own mind open. And I tell you, I came out of it, partly it's because the science has moved. A lot of the models that perhaps the most foresightful scientists were alarmed about in 1988 and 1997, if you look at those models today, they are much more pessimistic than they were even in 2003. The MIT model, which was partially funded by ExxonMobil, because they wanted to show how complex the modeling was. The MIT model in 2012 is blinking red. Now, it's And I was thinking, why is it that this accumulation of scientific insight isn't translating into public or public policy responses? And my thought is that Americans of the same diverse political perspectives and same arguments that we've had for 200 years, they have proved in the post-war period that they are willing to tax themselves to address threats to living generations, pollution threats to living generations. If you believe that dirty air or dirty water will affect your living children or your living grandchildren, you're willing to tax yourself to do something about it. Now, you may have an argument about what's the best way to implement that tax and to clean up this mess, but Americans, there is a national willingness to impose taxes to deal with threats to living generations. The problem with climate politics has been that at least until very recently, very few people believed it was a threat to living generations. They also couldn't see the contours of the threat. But that may be changing. Maybe it'll change over the next 5 or 10 years. I think Australia, which is a very resource-driven, very kind of very similar sort of cultural politics in the West, in the resource areas in the West to our Southwest, they were with us in kind of last man standing and resistance to global thinking about climate change. And they just passed a carbon tax a year and a half ago, and it followed the worst drought they'd had in 50, 100 years. And this is a country without any topsoil. And there was a kind of a tipping of public opinion. Well, if this is actually the weather we're going to have, we may have to get off this island. And so, you wonder at some stage this will come around, but you look at what the models show, the timeline is really not that flexible. That's scary. Yes, one more question.
I was just wondering, in terms of ExxonMobil and oil companies in general, how much they work together in different aspects of their business.
It's very interesting. I mean, if I were at Harvard Business School, I would write a PhD about it, because they're such frenemies, the way the business sets them up. They have to compete with each other, and they have intelligence departments to steal each other's contract information. They're constantly monitoring each other. But then, because of the scale of the projects and the amount of capital that's required and the risk sharing that's required to basically spread your bets around any region, Gulf of Mexico, Alaska, whatever, you have to do joint ventures all the time. So they go into cooperating partners, and they compete simultaneously. And the stakes in both fields, the competition and the cooperation, are enormous. So they each have these, they're set up almost like, it's like the United States and I don't know, France, China, something. They have some departments for cooperation, and then they have some departments for intelligence collection, and they have some departments for ruthless competition. And it's all set in a business. And most of the people they hire are people who did this in governments. And they all come out but anyway, I started to meet some of that. But it's because it's unusual in business to combine competition and cooperation in such deep and well-funded structures, I think. Normally it's one thing or the other.
Yeah.